All right, hi everybody. My name is Miss Daniel, and today I'll be reading a couple pages from George versus George for your assignment today. All right, so the first person we're going to look at is George Washington. All right, it says, a look at the life of George Washington and his countrymen. George Washington was married to a wealthy widow named Martha Custis. Tiny, outgoing, and plump, Martha was a charming hostess. That means she served like she did things at her house. More than 2,000 guests visited their Mount Vernon home in the years before 1775. Martha had two young children from her previous marriage, and Washington adored them. That means he loved those children very much. The couple enlarged Mount Vernon into an enormous self-contained community. That means they built the house up. Washington grew tobacco, then switched to wheat. Besides raising mules, sheep, hogs, and prize bulls, he also bred horses and foxhounds, netted tons of fish, and grew such things as wild grapes, Indian corn, oats, clover, flax, hemp, and nut, apple, pear, apricot, and cherry trees. He even grew orange trees that spent the winter in his greenhouse. Gardeners, shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, foremen, and sometimes Washington's nieces and nephews all lived on the estate. Like all other plantation owners at the time, Washington was a slave owner. By 1775, he owned 135 people. All right, and that is that page. Okay. Although 90% of the colonists in America lived out in the country, where new arrivals from Europe were amazed to find farmland, forests, fish, and game as far as the eye could see. So much fertile territory made it possible to supply Great Britain with raw goods such as furs, flour, iron, tobacco, and lumber in return for manufactured goods, including cloth, shoes, furniture, and tea from Great Britain. In small but bustling port cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston, whaling and shipbuilding were already major industries, and there were lumber mills, flour mills, factories, firehouses, and colleges. Streets, some paved, most full of mud or dust, overflowed with ox carts, horses and carriages, chimney sweeps, sailors, and carriers of wood. In local taverns, young girls danced lively jigs with their boyfriends. The most well off, best educated people were usually planters like George Washington, merchants, doctors, ministers, or lawyers. Next came a very large middle class that included small farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, craftsmen, and fishermen. The poorest were unskilled laborers, indentured servants, and of course, black slaves from Africa who were bought, sold, and held in bondage in all 13 of the colonies. Many colonists wanted to settle the new territory they had helped to win during the Seven Years' War, or the French and Indian War, but Great Britain made it illegal. London thought it was fairest and safest to reserve these lands for the Native Americans who had always lived and hunted there. George Washington agreed with plenty of other colonial settlers who thought the law unfairly limited their rights. They poured into the West anyway. So, despite what the British said, many of those colonists decided to move west, which were lands that were reserved for the Native Americans. All right, and so now we're going to read about the other George. And okay, hold on one second. Get my pages right. All right. All right. So it was the first page. All right. Excuse me. I look at the life of King George and his countrymen. George III was 22 years old when he succeeded his grandfather as king in 1760. He was married to a German princess named Charlotte, and they would become the parents of 15 children. Oh my goodness. The king was absolutely devoted to his family. Their favorite home was the palace in the English countryside, surrounded by roses, pinks, carnations, and orange, lemon, and tea trees. But they spent most of their time in a smaller brick red mansion called Buckingham House, usually known as the Queen's House, in London, England, the capital of Great Britain, where the king worked. London, oh, I need to show you this page with the king and the queen and some of their children, because obviously it says they had 15 children. London, with its 740,000 inhabitants, was the biggest city in Europe and the center of British government. And again, this is the 1700s, the 1760s, and afterwards. London's residents were proud of their long history and high level of cultural achievement. For fun, they went to mass balls and the theater, gambled at cards, dice, and roulette, belonged to all sorts of clubs, and met at coffee houses, taverns, cockfights, chop houses, and pleasure gardens. Noisy streets teemed with horses, carriages, ballad singers, flower sellers, fishmongers, and ladies and gentlemen in fancy white wigs wearing all the latest fashions. But the overcrowded city had its share of problems too. The death rate was high. All the coal that residents used as fuel caused black rain and thick, sooty smog. Food and drinking water were often unhealthy. Riots were coming, and public hangings drew rowdy mobs. Wow, public hangings. Hmm. Thousands of beggars and pickpockets were evidence of poverty run amok. All right, and then here's a caption, and I'm going to read that caption. It says, enormous crowds from all classes flocked to watch summer concerts in London's 15 pleasure gardens. All right. The English were convinced that the rest of the British Empire was backward and uncivilized. King George ruled 31 colonies and other possessions in many parts of the world, from Borneo to the Bay of Bengal and all the way to Honduras. Though throughout England, people argued constantly about world politics, but they would soon argue especially hard about the uprising in America. All right, and here's that page. And so I'm going to read some more about the two Georges. There was a page that compared the two, and you guys are going to get this. All right, so I'm going to go over this page. Okay. And it says, oh, that's the wrong version. All right, so those were some people. All right, so basically, those were some people, and then here's King George with his comment, his statement. The New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Blows must decide whether they are subject to this country or independent. And that was my my British accent, by the way. And then so here's George Washington on this page. It says, I am ready to raise 1,000 men, subsist them myself at my own expense, and march at their head to Boston. And you guys are going to understand why they were arguing, right? Because last week you learned about the French and Indian War, and you guys are going to learn some more about the French and Indian War. So in the midst of this, we are introduced to King George, and then we also introduced to King George and what he feels, as well as George Washington, who would eventually become the first president of what would become the United States of America. All right. Thank you guys for listening. Good luck on your assignment. And please take your time and try your very, very best. And make sure you're answering complete sentences and your work makes sense. Okay. And always, 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 always double check your work, because your work is a reflection of you. Just like what I do is a reflection of me, what you do is a reflection of you. So good luck, you guys.